I know one word of Polish, dziękuję. I'm happy to be here, and I hope to learn more Polish by the time I leave. So my talk is, I'm going to talk about my book, which is called Restructuring Sociology, which was meant to be an introduction to critical realism, but it's also a critique of American sociology, which is kind of hegemonic and very critical of that. And so I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker in my presentation than I was. So my book, the introduction, has outlines what I say 7 myths of American sociology, but these myths probably characterize worldwide sociology that has been influenced by British and American sociology in particular. And I'm going to go through these myths in my talk today. So the first myth is that historical and ethnographic narrative don't explain. And you say, well, this is a myth that comes out of the positivist tradition, which understands causality in terms of laws. And so the laws take a form of if-then form, that if, as I said there, x1 through xn occur, then some consequent event y will occur. And the thing about this understanding of causality, it's a regularity view of causality, is that to find causality, it's tied to generality. You really can't have causality if you're looking at, on this view, if you're looking at an ethnography, a single case, or you're looking historically. And traditionally, these kinds of analyses have been dismissed as just descriptive because they don't take the form of general laws. If you need a law to be, if you need for causality to have a general law, then you have to really look at a general case, and then that privileges the statistical approach, and we end up with the bottom there with the regression equation as the classical kind of account, causal account in sociology. Okay, so the alternative, one thing about the general positivist approach is that when you have this equation that all these x's that are weighted so much lead you to this consequent event, one thing that doesn't tell you is, well, what is it about each x that contributes to this effect? What is it about the, what you could call the causal mechanism? And that's missing. And what critical realism tries to do is provide what we call causal mechanism. So according to critical realism, causality is not about general laws. One thing that the positivist approach kind of does is it sucks the action out of the things of the world, the causal power out of the things of the world, and locates it in these laws. That if this event happens, then that event happens. What critical realism says is that it's the things of the world that have causal power that make things happen, like a clock. And so the clock has the causal power to tell time. You say, well, why does it have that power? Well, there's a generative mechanism that in the clock that makes this happen. So the clock is made up of all these different parts, among other things, gears, an escapement, a time indicator. And not only do you need these individual parts, but they have to be arranged properly. And this arrangement is a structure. So for critical realism, we try to talk about generative structures behind things. What is the structure that leads to the causal effect? And that's going to be true when we move from inanimate objects, the natural world, to social structure. Social structure is going to be an arrangement, an organization of elements. Usually we're going to talk about social positions. Now, a clock, we don't think that everything is a clockwork. So there's sometimes this notion of mechanism is associated in English anyway with mechanistic, which sounds deterministic. But mechanisms need not be mechanistic in that sense, and they don't have to be clockwork. They can be indeterminate, and we don't think that the determinism operates on the social level. So when you talk about people behaving for reasons, that's the mechanism. The whole folk psychology in which we explain our behavior in terms of our wants, beliefs, or intentions. It's not like a clock, but it's the mechanism in which we explain behavior. And the other thing about this notion, this working on mechanisms, is that's very important about critical realism, that distinguishes it from the positivist view. Remember I said in the positivist view, causality was tied to generality. Critical realists say, no, causality and generality are two separate things. So we could ask, well, what's the causal mechanism operating in a particular case that makes people, for example, in this ethnographic case, deprived of power, let's say. And you could identify the mechanism, and it may only happen once. Same with a historical example. Like the words I'm saying right now, I may never repeat again, but they're still having some causal effect, conveying information, creating currents in the air. There's all kinds of causal effects I'm having right now, but they don't have to be repeated, and there's no necessary law that's governing what I'm saying right now. So for the critical realist approach, there's two separate questions. One is, what's the mechanism operating in this particular case, whether it's historical or ethnographic? And second is, how general is it? Well, that's a separate question, but you don't need generality to identify causality. The causes can happen in a unique event, and in historical cases, if you're looking at history, they could be a conjuncture of mechanisms that operate. Cultural mechanisms, structural mechanisms, how they all come together in a unique way to produce a unique event in that situation. To give you an example, so what you see here is a passage from Marx. So what critical realism does is it reduces statistical analysis, regression equations, and other kinds of statistics from a privileged position and saying explanation doesn't have to take the form. Actually, explanation should not take the form of an equation. Explanation ought to take the form of a narrative. We don't dismiss statistics, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But we say that actually the form of an explanation ought to be narrative, which means that ethnography and historical analysis are recovered as legitimate forms of explanation, of causal explanation. So I illustrate these things in this passage from Marx. What you can see here is Marx calling for a conjuncture of different processes that occurred to create what became the capitalist system, or primitive accumulation, colonization, enslavement, all of these things, European imperialism, had to come together in a unique way to give us this result. It's a narrative, and this is the form that an explanation should take according to critical realism. But the seventh myth that I talk about in my book is a dismissal of statistics. The fact that we say that a statistical equation is not an explanation doesn't mean that we should get rid of statistical analysis. So the difference is that what statistics does, statistical analysis, and I do mixed methods research myself. What statistics does is it's not an explanation, but it's possible evidence in favor of an explanation. It's one piece of evidence that could be used. So it's a demotion of statistics from explanation to evidence. And let me just say here that there's two types of questions you can ask, and this comes from my own research on the Iraq War. And one of the things I was looking at was looking at two different things in my analysis of how the American public and newspapers debated both our entrance into the Iraq War, our attack on Iraq, and the revelations of torture at Abu Ghraib and elsewhere. So I wanted to know, to what extent did the American public debate these things in a moral way, as opposed to a prudential way? Well, what do I mean? Well, actually, there was a difference, and so what I'm trying to show here, the New York Times is the secular press. I compared the secular press with the religious press. Tikkun is a left-wing Jewish publication. But I looked at Catholic and Protestant publications as well. So I had two questions. One is, was there more moral debate in the religious press or in the secular press? And actually in the secular press I didn't find any moral debate, very little moral debate. So questions of torture, the secular press too was very against what the United States was doing in terms of torture. But their reasoning was very prudential rather than moral. They said, well, you know, if we torture them, they'll torture our guys. Or torture is not good, it's giving a propaganda victory to the opposite side. That's very prudential. What you found in the religious press is more arguments about the sanctity of a human being, and is torture ever allowed, even if it's of some utility in saving lives. So there was moral discussion in the religious press, but not in the secular press. So there's two different kinds of questions that have two different kinds of methodologies. One is a question of counts. Was there more moral argumentation in the religious press than in the secular press? Well, that's a question that you need statistics to answer, and I use statistics. But then there's another kind of question is, how did the secular press in particular reframe moral arguments to be non-moral or utilitarian? Well, that's a textual kind of question, a discourse kind of question. So in the first question, I used statistical content analysis, but in the second question, I addressed by doing a close reading, what people in literature call close reading, which is a form of discourse analysis. So you see that there's different kinds of questions that require different methodologies. And one of the virtues of critical realism is that once you move beyond the positivist notion of causality involving laws, it can unite the discipline methodologically. So we don't dismiss the statistics and say, well, we're not going to do that anymore. There's actually no foundationalism in critical realism, no critical realist method. The method should fit the questions. And so there's multiple methods. Okay. So myth 4 here that I talk about is that the most important questions are empirical. Skipping. Yeah. So here we come to the heart with this notion that questions are empirical. We come to the heart of American empiricism. And I think that this is not just American, but if you ask people which kind of question can be proven, empirical questions or conceptual questions, everyone thinks, oh, the answer is obvious, it's empirical. But actually, no, nothing empirical can be proven in the sense of a mathematical proof. Only math and logic, which is conceptual, can be proven. So actually, if you want proofs, as opposed to better or weaker arguments, you need conceptual questions rather than empirical questions. But American sociology going along with this emphasis on empiricism, American sociology thinks that American sociology has dismissed philosophy. One of the things that distinguishes American sociology, and I think sociology more generally, you can tell me whether that's true here in Poland, is that there's a disregard for conceptual questions. There's the emphasis is on questions that can only be answered empirically by the collection of data. But a lot of, you don't really know what you're talking about unless you engage conceptually with things. So in this slide, what I have are 3 different notions of what a mechanism is that comes from various sociologists. And I just want to look at them and show how vulnerable much of our sociological formulations are to philosophical critique. And so I hope it'll become clearer as I go through this why we need conceptual analysis. So one of the things about critical realism is it says that empirical questions have been too privileged, that we need to return to more conceptual issues. So you have here, I put here 3 different definitions of mechanisms. The first comes from Charles Tilly and underlies his approach to contentious politics. The second from John Elster is meant to underlie analytical sociology, and the third offered by Neil Gross is a pragmatist understanding of mechanisms. So I'm going to argue now that all 3 are flawed and therefore misdirect our empirical research. Let me just start by saying, so Tilly's definition is that mechanisms are causes on the small scale. That's what he thinks mechanisms are. Causes on the small scale, similar events that produce essentially the same immediate effect across a wide range of circumstances. Well, that comes back to the statistical notion, the regularity notion we saw at the beginning that I said was law-like regularity. Elster tells us that mechanisms are recurring and intelligible patterns. Again, it's kind of a regularity notion. And finally, from Gross, we have mechanisms or chains or aggregations of actors. Mechanisms are chains or aggregations of actors confronting problem situations. So going back to Tilly, it's good that he connects mechanisms with causes or causal powers, but consider how he unpacks the connection. First, what comes after the colon? Tilly seems to remain tied, as I say, to some kind of regularity notion of causality, and he thinks of mechanisms exclusively as events, which also conforms to the regularity view. But he also thinks before the colon that mechanisms are exclusively small scale. So, according to Tilly's definition, there are no macro mechanisms. So, the next slide is consider inequality. So the first question I have about inequality is, does inequality matter? Well, can we really say no? The economists already have saying that inequality does matter. So I hope in sociology we're not going to say that inequality doesn't matter. So if inequality matters in some way, then it has causal powers, in which case it's also a mechanism, exerting its own effects. Now let's see if inequality is covered by Tilly's definition. Is inequality an event? Remember that Tilly is saying that it's a regular pattern. I suppose you could say it's a long-term event, but that sounds a little strange. Is inequality, remember that Tilly says that inequality, that mechanisms are operate on the small scale. Well, is inequality necessarily small scale? What I have here now is a picture of a map of the world that's drawn according to the distribution of wealth. And what you see is the familiar north-south divide here, where the northern hemisphere has much more wealth than the southern hemisphere. That's not a mechanism on the small scale. So there's something wrong conceptually with Tilly's definition. Inequality can operate on the large scale. Following Tilly's definition, we can deny that inequality is a mechanism, or we can say there's something wrong with Tilly's definition. What Americans would tend to opt for is a third choice. They would just say, never mind all these words, and just get to work collecting data. But what data are you going to collect? If your founding principles exclude large-scale mechanisms, then you're less likely to collect data about them. Let's next see if Neil Gross's pragmatic definition of mechanism covers inequality. Let me just remind you again what Gross says. According to Gross, mechanisms are chains or aggregations of actors confronting problem situations. Like a lot of sociology today, pragmatism likes to emphasize habit and non-consciousness. In my book, I say American sociology prefers to study not conscious persons, but zombies. But I'll come back to that. For now, let's just see if Gross's definition otherwise fits. Is inequality a chain or an aggregation of actors confronting a problem situation? I don't think so. In fact, inequality is the problem situation. But according to Gross's definition, problem situations are not mechanisms, which is peculiar because by definition, a problem situation is a situation that causes problems. And that causal power makes it a mechanism. So Gross's pragmatism would like to reduce all social causality to human action. But inequality is a result from human action without itself being a human action. It's kind of a condition. Okay. So I'm going to tell you what inequality is according to critical realism, or at least the strain of critical realism that I represent. According to us, inequality is an arrangement. Remember I asked you when we talked about the clock and the clockwork, to remember an arrangement is a structure? So I said a structure is a relation or a weave of relations. In this case, inequality is a single relation. And when we spoke of a relational arrangement, when we spoke of relational arrangements with reference to watches, we said the arrangement was a mechanism. And so it is here. Insofar as it is causally consequential, inequality is a mechanism, the causal effects of which should be investigated. But unless we properly understand the ontology of inequality, we'll not investigate it. So I've been trying to illustrate three things in these last couple of slides. First, the importance of conceptual analysis. Second, the importance of thinking ontologically about what is a relation, what's a structure, what's inequality. And third, how the critical realist conception of mechanisms is distinct in sociology. It's distinct in being broader, and in being broader, inclusive of other things like social structural conditions that ought to be covered by the work mechanism, but which you can see the three attempts that I illustrated, Elster's and Tilley's and Gross's do not. Skip that. Let me talk about Bourdieu. So, a lot of American sociologists like to talk about Bourdieu. And we critical realists are actually divided on Bourdieu. Some like Andrew Sayre, Gorski, George Steinmetz, and Frederick Vandenberg embrace Bourdieu as a critical realist. In contrast, Margaret Archer, who studied with Bourdieu, rejects this concept of habitus. I too think Bourdieu and American sociology have pushed habitus and habit and the unconscious all too far. My problem with Bourdieu regarding social structure is that Bourdieu seems to speak in two voices. So the first quotation on this slide, from the Rules of Art, the Principles of Economic Sociology reads, an artistic field is not reducible to the sum of individual agents linked by simple relations of interaction, or more precisely cooperation. What is lacking, among other things, are the objective relations which are constitutive of the structure of the field in which oriented struggles aiming at conserving and transforming it. In reference to objective relations, Bourdieu evidently wants to emphasize them. But Bourdieu says that these relations are constitutive of structure. So for critical realism, social structure consists of objective social relations between people. It's not a schema or a rule or even just a resource. Social structure for Bourdieu is a relational arrangement distinct from interaction. But the structural, so when Reduce speaks of the structure of the field in terms of unequal distribution of capital, that structure is something objective. So I, in my strain of critical realism, are all with Bourdieu here. It is not, however, the Bourdieu that American sociology likes. American sociology prefers Bourdieu, which comes from Louis Foucault, which says that habitus is based on a non-Cartesian social ontology that refuses to split subject and object, intention and cause, materiality and symbolic representation. So Bourdieu can't have it both ways. If there are ontologically objective social relations, then we have to have at least two of the three Cartesian splits that the Francis Bourdieu would rather overcome. Specifically, the subject must be separate from the object and symbolic representation separate from materiality. Otherwise, there's no sense of calling the social relations objective as Bourdieu does. So I'm going to just skip now to, I think this is the myth of the cogito, dismissal and okay. So the fifth myth, the 14th myth is in my book. It's that sociology can and should dispense with the Cartesian cogito, by which I mean the centric consciousness and intentionality that Foucault tells us Bourdieu wants to displace. And Swidler says the same thing. She says, whether practices refer to individual habits or organizational routines, the focus is on practices shifting away from what may or may not go on in an actor's consciousness, their ideas or value commitments, and toward the unconscious or automatic activities embedded and taken for granted routines. So Swidler wants to bypass conscious intentionality in favor of unconscious or automatic activities embedded for taken for granted routines. And here you see in this slide, I'll just go through this slide here. Drawing on the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, people want to say that our conscious thought is like the rider on an elephant, that most of what's going on consciously is, most of what's going on in our behavior is unconscious, and that we just, after the fact, introduce conscious rationales. But that, part of the reason, part of the mistake here, I think, if you look at the chessboard, is we tend to think of conscious activity as something, conscious intentionality, as something that we come to after long moments behind the chessboard when we do some calculation. And so we say, well, a lot of our behavior isn't like that. My behavior right now isn't like that. I mean, I'm speaking. I'm not rehearsing in my mind what I'm about to say before I say it. It just sort of comes out. But talk is one of the paradigm cases of conscious intentional activity. I'm conscious of what I'm doing right now. I'm not spending a lot of forethought as I'm saying it. It's just coming out. So the dismissal of consciousness, this kind of anti-humanism in the discipline, critical realism is a strong proponent of. For one thing, if you dismiss our conscious actions, you're really impugning our status as moral agents. And the last picture there, where you see early humans trying to kill a mammoth, what I argue is this dismissal of conscious intentionality, which is very prevalent in the discipline, makes no sense because we're social creatures. And we survive by coordinating our activities, whether it's killing a mastodon or sending a rocket to the moon. We have to coordinate our activities. I arranged to be here months ago. If I wasn't consciously in control of my activity, there'd be no guarantee I would be here. Same with you. So we have to be in considerable control of our behavior. It doesn't mean that everything we do is conscious, but you can't utterly displace the conscious aspects of our activity in favor of the unconscious. I'm gonna actually just say this and start with this. So, the third myth in American sociology is that there is no truth, or we can't know the truth. But critical realism argues that the truth is out there, or at least reality is out there. One of the reasons that American sociology and sociology generally has argued that there is no truth is because it has an overly epistemic approach to truth. The truth is based on some foundational methodology that if we follow, we'll end up with the truth. So the truth becomes equated with the certainty we achieve by following our methods. The postmodernists, the post-structuralists argue that those methods fail to achieve certainty, so there is no truth. What critical realism argues is that truth should not be understood in epistemic terms, but in ontological terms. Truth isn't just a matter of how certain you are. Truth is a matter of what in philosophy is sometimes called the correspondence view of truth. That truth, what we say or believe is true if it matches reality. So the truth maker is not our methods. That's not what makes truth truth. The truth is reality itself. Does what we say and do match reality? And that means that what we say may be true, even if we're not certain. There are many degrees of knowledge below certainty. If you think in terms of a criminal case, at least in the United States, we say you have to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt. Doesn't mean there's all doubt. It doesn't mean you have to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt. And in tort cases, you don't even need that certain level of certainty. It's just a preponderance of the evidence. So how we know the truth is different than what the truth is. The truth is the match between what we say or believe and reality. How do we know whether there's a match? We know fallibly. Our knowledge is fallible, but that doesn't mean there is no truth. So, as I say, here's my last slide. That the truth is out there, but our job is to find it using our fallible methods. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your exciting master lecture.